There are moments heaven goes quiet. You pray, you cry, you wait, but no answer comes. Yet in that silence, God is not absent. He's at work behind the curtain of time. His silence is not punishment, it's preparation. Because sometimes, heaven hides the answer to strengthen your faith for what's coming next. When God is silent, it's not because he has forgotten you, but because he is forming something greater than what you asked for. Silence is his way of shifting your dependence from results to relationship, from impatience to endurance, from sight to faith. The silence of God is the training ground of trust. It is where warriors are made, where roots grow deep, and where spiritual muscles form. Every delay is a classroom where your spirit learns to stand without shaking. The silence doesn't mean God said no. It often means it's in those wordless nights that he refines your motives and purifies your desires. When heaven is quiet, the earth trembles because God is orchestrating something powerful beyond human timing. When God hides his face, he's not withdrawing, he's revealing something deeper. Think of Joseph in the pit, David in the cave, Esther in the palace, and Jesus in the tomb. Each faced silence before the spotlight. The pit was silent, but purpose was alive. The cave was quiet, but the crown was near. The tomb was sealed, but resurrection was coming. In every divine pause, there is an unseen preparation, a holy construction happening beyond your view. Silence tests what applause cannot. It asks, will you still believe when there's no sign, no sound, and no confirmation? This is where faith graduates, when you keep walking even when heaven seems muted. The silence of God is not the absence of his presence. It is the abundance of his wisdom. It is the space where your faith becomes unshakable, because it's no longer built on feelings, but on revelation. When prayers seem unanswered, heaven is often arranging the stage for a bigger testimony. God's silence means the script is being edited by divine hands. What looks like a delay is actually protection from premature exposure. The silence teaches you to rest in his sovereignty, to trust that he is not just hearing your words, but preparing your world. In silence, the noise of doubt fades. The distractions lose power. You start to discern not just what you want from God, but what God wants from you. Silence is where revelation is born. When you stop talking and start trusting, heaven whispers secrets that words cannot hold. It's the womb of wisdom, the cradle of faith, and the furnace of transformation. Every silent season carries hidden instruction. God's quiet seasons teach patience, discernment, and spiritual maturity. He allows stillness to detox your soul from noise, so you can hear his heartbeat again. The silence is not void. It's sacred ground where your spirit learns to hear without sound. When you think God is not speaking, look again. He might be speaking through circumstances, through closed doors, through delays, through peace that makes no sense. His silence is not absence, it's coded communication. The teacher is silent when the student is being tested, but his eyes never leave the paper. The silence of God exposes idols. It shows what you truly trust, your own effort or his promise. Many lose faith in silence because they worship the answer, not the answerer. But those who endure silence with worship graduate into dimensions of glory that others only dream about. God hides to reveal. He withholds to deepen. He delays to prepare. And when the silence finally breaks, the sound that follows shakes nations. The very thing you prayed for in tears becomes a testimony that multiplies faith in others. Every quiet night turns into a morning of answered prayer. Every hidden season gives birth to unshakable belief. When God is silent, he is rewriting your story in invisible ink. You may not see the words, but they are forming with divine precision. His silence is the pen stroke of eternity, crafting answers that will outlive the question. Every second of stillness is pregnant with divine movement. Heaven does not rush what it is refining. The delay you feel is often heaven's design to mature your spirit for what your destiny demands. God's silence is never empty. It's loaded with instructions that can only be understood in stillness. There are seasons when God removes all external confirmations so you can learn to hear his voice internally. He hides your evidence so that your faith can find its own voice. He takes away the crowd, the noise, and the obvious signs, because he wants to teach you that true confidence doesn't come from outcomes, but from obedience. When you can trust God in the dark, you've graduated from religion to revelation. His silence forces you to know him, not just need him. In that sacred silence, heaven begins to shape your spiritual perception. You start to discern that what feels like rejection is actually redirection. You begin to understand that the unanswered prayer was never ignored. It was being rewritten to align with divine timing. The silence trains your spirit to see the invisible hand of God in the unseen moments of life. You start realizing that his absence is an illusion. His presence was hidden in the process all along. When the voice of God seems missing, remember that the word of God still stands. Silence does not mean God stopped speaking. It means he already said enough. The Bible becomes your compass when heaven seems quiet. It's in this season that scriptures you once read begin to breathe, and verses you once quoted begin to live inside you. The word becomes your dialogue with the silent God. God's silence is not a wall, it's a whisper. He draws you close enough to feel his heart instead of hearing his voice. It is intimacy, wrapped in stillness. Sometimes God quiets your life, not to punish you, but to purify your hearing. Because when the noise stops, the soul starts to recognize the gentle rhythm of divine order. You stop striving to hear, and you start learning to trust. That's where peace begins. The greatest anointings are born in seasons of silence. David learned worship in caves before he sang before crowds. Elijah heard God not in the wind or fire, but in the still, small voice. Jesus endured 30 silent years before 3 years of miracles. The pattern is divine. Before God announces you publicly, he processes you privately. His silence is his signature of investment in your destiny. He doesn't waste words on unfinished vessels. When heaven is silent, hell gets loud. The enemy will try to use the quietness of God to plant lies in your mind. God has left you. Your prayers are wasted. You're forgotten. But that's when you must remember, silence is a shield, not a sentence. God is still on the throne, and every quiet hour is a prophecy being written in secret. The darker the night, the louder the dawn will speak. In silence, you learn what it means to walk by faith, not by sight. You stop begging for signs and start building on promises. Every unanswered prayer becomes a brick in your foundation. You become unshakable because your hope no longer depends on noise. You are being refined like gold in a furnace. Silence is the heat, and endurance is the shine. When God hides his hand, it's because he's revealing his heart. The waiting teaches you more about his nature than the answer ever could. You start to see that his silence was not cruelty, it was care. He loved you enough to make you wait until you could handle what you asked for. Some blessings are too heavy for untrained hands, so he allows silence to strengthen your grip. The moment heaven speaks again, it won't sound like it used to, because silence changes your ears. You'll no longer crave noise. You'll crave presence. You'll no longer panic in delay. You'll discern purpose in waiting. Silence turns believers into warriors and worshippers into watchmen. When you survive the silence, you no longer chase miracles. You become one. When God is silent, the unseen world is active. Angels are moving, destinies are aligning, and what looks like stillness is actually strategy. Heaven's silence does not mean inactivity. It means divine activity hidden from human sight. God works best behind the curtain, where human understanding cannot interrupt his design. You are not being ignored. You are being engineered. Every unanswered prayer, every quiet night, every tear shed in confusion is a brick in the invisible structure of your testimony. There are answers you cannot handle until silence matures you. Some revelations are too weighty for the untested. God's silence becomes the filter that separates the immature from the ready. When he hides his voice, he watches your posture. Will you complain or will you trust? Will you panic or will you praise? The silence of God is a sacred sieve. Only those who stay faithful through quietness are trusted with divine secrets. When the silence stretches long, remember that God speaks through time as much as through words. His silence is the language of patience. The calendar of heaven is not controlled by the urgency of man. God delays not because he is late, but because he is exact. He is perfecting the timing so that when he answers, everything falls into alignment. Doors, people, seasons, and resources. One divine word at the wrong time would destroy what silence is preparing. God's silence can feel like distance, but it is actually depth. He pulls back to draw you deeper. He hides so you can seek. His silence awakens hunger. the kind that refuses to settle for surface prayers. It's in this hunger that intimacy is born. Silence separates the casual seeker from the desperate believer. When words from heaven stop, groanings of the Spirit begin. That's where true intercession rises, when silence becomes your song. Many think silence means God is doing nothing, but the truth is, He's building everything. Noah heard no voice while the rain delayed, yet he kept building. Abraham heard no confirmation for decades, yet he kept walking. Hannah wept in years of silence, but her womb later carried a prophet. Silence is not proof of God's absence. It's evidence of His attention. The more silent He seems, the more He's shaping something significant. In divine silence, faith becomes sight turned inward. You start to see God not with your eyes, but with your spirit. Silence develops spiritual sensitivity. Your ears begin to recognize movements in the unseen. You start perceiving God's answers in subtle shifts. A door that closes, a peace that remains, a burden that lifts. Silence sharpens your discernment until obedience becomes your only compass. Every silent season builds authority. When you survive a silent God, you gain a voice that carries weight in the Spirit. Those who have endured the stillness of heaven carry an unshakable presence because they have walked through divine invisibility and still believed. When they speak, their words carry fire because they've been refined in quiet flames. God's silence becomes your ordination. His delay becomes your mantle. When you finally come out of a silent season, you realize that what you gained was far greater than what you asked for. You wanted answers. He gave you endurance. You wanted signs. He gave you sight. You wanted solutions. He gave you strength. The silence was not a prison. It was preparation for elevation. Every great destiny carries a silent chapter that few understand, but heaven celebrates. The silence of God also reveals the noise in your heart. It unmasks hidden fears, pride, and impatience. It shows you what truly drives you, your faith or your feelings. In the quiet, your motives are purified, and your priorities are rearranged. By the time God speaks again, you are no longer desperate for relief, but ready for responsibility. Silence prepares you to handle the answer with wisdom. When God finally breaks the silence, the sound carries multiplied power. One word from heaven after years of quiet can reverse decades of delay. Joseph's come forth moment from prison to palace came after 13 years of divine silence. Jesus' Lazarus come forth broke the stillness of a tomb. God's silence is always followed by a sound that shakes eternity. The greater the silence, the louder the manifestation. Heaven's quiet moments are heaven's greatest gifts. They teach you to worship without music, to believe without proof, to rest without explanation. When you stop fighting the silence and start embracing it, you enter the dimension of divine trust. That's where your spirit finds stability no matter what the season says. Because when God is silent, He's not far. He's forming. He's shaping your identity in the silence, fortifying your faith in the delay, and preparing your destiny behind closed doors. His silence is not the end of your story. It's the deep breath before the greatest chapter begins. When God is silent, He is sanctifying your focus. He strips away distractions, unnecessary attachments, and shallow dependencies, so your eyes can be fixed only on Him. His quietness forces you to confront what you truly rely on. When the noise fades, you start to see what had been standing between you and divine clarity. The silence becomes a holy surgery, removing voices that drowned out His whisper. He allows isolation to produce revelation, because sometimes you must lose connection with the world to gain communion with heaven. In the silence, your prayers become more real. You stop performing before God and start pouring before Him. You stop saying rehearsed lines and start releasing your soul. Silence breaks religious habit and replaces it with raw honesty. That's when your tears become language, your sighs become petitions, and your stillness becomes worship. In that depth, God doesn't need to speak with words. His peace becomes the answer. The silence of God transforms waiting into worship. You begin to understand that every delay is an altar, and every unanswered prayer is an invitation to praise. You realize faith is not proven when God says yes, but when He says nothing. True faith doesn't demand sound. It survives silence. Those who can worship when heaven is quiet have entered a dimension few can stand in. the realm where trust itself becomes incense before the throne. Every prophet, every general of faith, every vessel of power has passed through the wilderness of silence. Moses heard nothing for years in Midian before encountering the burning bush. David sang to empty caves before leading nations in worship. Jesus endured divine quietness in Gethsemane before victory on the cross. Silence is heaven's school for divine authority. It's where you learn to interpret absence as assignment. When God seems far, he is actually near in a different form. He hides not to punish, but to provoke pursuit. He wants your desire to outweigh your doubt. When God withdraws his voice, he's testing if you'll chase his presence or his promises. The silence reveals lovers, not just followers. It separates those who want his hand from those who seek his heart. Heaven's silence humbles the soul. It teaches you to depend not on understanding, but on surrender. In silence, you realize you don't need to figure God out. You just need to stay faithful. The answers you long for are often hidden within obedience. Every step you take in faith without confirmation writes your name deeper in the record of divine trust. The quietness of God refines you into a vessel he can trust with revelation. The silent seasons also prepare you for the voices you'll carry later. Those who have walked through divine silence speak with authority because they've been processed in pain. Their prayers shake atmospheres because their words were born from fire, not comfort. Heaven's silence is the secret behind every voice that changes generations. Before God gives you a message to the world, he first gives you silence to shape your soul. There's also a holy mystery in divine timing. Sometimes God's silence means someone else's obedience must catch up with your prayer. The answer is ready, but the alignment is not. Heaven waits until everything fits, people, place, and purpose, before releasing what you've been waiting for. If God spoke too soon, the blessing would fall into wrong hands. Silence guards the promise until the stage is ready. When you've waited long enough and the silence finally breaks, it won't come as a whisper, it will come as a wave. The very thing that seemed delayed will rush in suddenly. The pain of waiting will dissolve in the glory of manifestation. What once confused you will now make sense. You'll look back and realize the silence was not wasted time. It was preparation for acceleration. And when that divine sound comes, it doesn't just answer your prayer. It shifts your identity. You'll never fear silence again because you'll recognize it as sacred ground. You'll start to welcome quiet seasons as proof that heaven is near, because now you understand. God's silence is not the end of conversation. It's the beginning of transformation. When God is silent, something within you is being redefined. The silence rewires your heart from panic to patience, from questioning to confidence. You begin to understand that God's voice is not the only proof of his presence. Sometimes his stillness is the loudest sermon. His quiet is a sanctuary where faith matures from infancy to authority. In that wordless chamber, you learn that real strength is not found in what you hear, but in what you hold on to when nothing is said. Divine silence reveals divine sovereignty. It reminds you that God is not a servant to your schedule. He speaks when the fullness of time has come, not a second before. The delay is not denial, it is divine alignment. Heaven measures maturity not by how fast you hear, but by how long you trust. Every time you choose faith over frustration, you are being crowned with endurance. The silence becomes sacred training for supernatural confidence. When heaven stops speaking, hell starts testing. The enemy thrives in noise, but trembles in silence. He wants you to believe that silence means abandonment. But heaven uses it to expose every false foundation in your soul. Silence reveals where your faith leaks. It uncovers where you've built trust on emotions instead of revelation. Once you see that, you no longer need constant affirmation. You become anchored. Silence produces warriors who walk by revelation, not reassurance. There are seasons where heaven goes silent because the test is in progress. The teacher doesn't talk during the exam. He's already given you what you need in previous lessons. The question now is, will you remember or will you retreat? Silence pushes you to recall every word, every promise, every prophecy. What you do in silence determines what God will do in manifestation. When God hides his voice, He is protecting his will. If he spoke too soon, you would move before time. If he gave too many details, the enemy would prepare a counterattack. Silence is God's shield of strategy. He hides your next move in mystery so that no power of darkness can interfere. What feels like uncertainty is actually divine secrecy, heaven's way of keeping your destiny secure. The silence of God is not the end of his plan. It's the turning of the page. Every divine story has quiet chapters where nothing seems to move, yet everything is being written. Abraham had to wait decades before the sound of laughter filled his tent. Joseph spent years in a prison before the echo of purpose reached Pharaoh's palace. Even Jesus lay in the tomb wrapped in silence before resurrection thundered through the ages. Every silence ends in sound, and every sound brings glory. When you learn to love the silence, you stop demanding answers and start discerning timing. You begin to realize that waiting is not wasting, it's working. Silence matures your spirit and stretches your trust until you can stand even when heaven is still. You stop asking, God, when will you speak? And start saying, God, until you do, I'll worship. That is the posture that opens the heavens again. In the silence, God molds prophets out of ordinary people. He teaches them to hear beyond noise and to see beyond sight. He teaches them to interpret stillness as strategy. Those who have survived divine quietness become carriers of divine revelation. Their voice shakes realms because they learned to echo the heart of God, even when he seemed far. The silence becomes their ordination ground, the place where heaven stamps authority upon their spirit. Silence is also the womb of divine transition. Before every shift, heaven falls still. The same way creation paused before light appeared, silence always precedes revelation. You are not being delayed. You are being repositioned. The stillness is proof that something new is about to break forth. When heaven stops speaking, it's because it's about to move. When the silence breaks, it never comes gently. It comes suddenly. It comes with restoration, with favor, with acceleration. Everything that was quiet begins to speak at once. Delayed blessings start finding their way to you. Doors that were shut burst open, and opportunities you forgot resurface in your favor. The same God who was silent begins to speak through manifestation, through results that cannot be denied. And when you finally look back, you'll thank God for every quiet night, every unanswered prayer, every delayed promise. Because now you see that silence was not punishment, it was promotion. It built the kind of faith that storms cannot sink. It taught you to walk by revelation, not reaction. It made you stronger than the season that tried to break you. So when heaven is silent again, you won't fear. You'll rest. You'll smile because you'll know the silence is working for you. You'll say, God is quiet, therefore something powerful is coming. That's when you realize silence was never the absence of his voice. It was the presence of his hands. When God is silent, he is planting the seeds of a greater manifestation. What you call delay, heaven calls design. His quiet seasons are not empty. They are wombs carrying answers that must mature before birth. Silence is where God conceives miracles in secret, and when the time is right, he unveils them in glory. You may not hear him, but he is speaking in movements you cannot see, aligning people, opening unseen paths, and rearranging your destiny behind the veil of time. In silence, your faith is no longer theory. It becomes your heartbeat. You start to walk by conviction rather than confirmation. You don't need signs to keep standing because you've learned that his presence is greater than his performance. When heaven withholds sound, it is giving you substance. That's how faith graduates from hearing to knowing. You stop asking, where is God? And begin declaring, he is here, even when I hear nothing. God's silence is a mystery that produces maturity. It is where your identity is refined and your authority is built. You discover that silence was never punishment. It was preparation for dominion. In that hidden process, God is pruning your impatience, cleansing your motives, and stretching your capacity to receive. He cannot release big answers to small vessels, so he uses silence to enlarge your spirit. Every moment of waiting is heaven expanding you for greater glory. When God stops answering your old prayers, it's often because he is preparing you for a higher conversation. Silence shifts your focus from what you want to who he is. You start seeking not for provision, but for presence, not for blessings, but for alignment. The silence becomes holy language, a communication deeper than words. You start to sense him in the stillness, and peace becomes your interpreter. There is a power that only silence can teach. It teaches you how to move when you can't hear, how to stand when you can't see, how to believe when you can't feel. Silence is God's way of training generals of faith. Every servant who will carry fire must first survive stillness. If you can remain steadfast when heaven is quiet, you can be trusted when heaven speaks. Silence is the space between promise and performance. It's the valley where your hope is tested and your trust is proven. Many give up here because they mistake silence for absence. But those who endure will see that heaven was never silent. It was symphonic. Every unanswered prayer, every night of tears, every waiting season was part of the melody God was composing. When the song finally plays, it carries power that echoes through generations. When heaven breaks its silence, it doesn't whisper, it roars. Every closed door opens in one moment. Every forgotten seed blooms overnight. Every delayed dream resurrects in divine speed. The years of silence collapse into seconds of manifestation. What you thought was lost returns, multiplied. That's the power of divine timing. God may be silent for years, but when he speaks once, it changes everything. The silent seasons also reveal your calling. When the noise of the world dies down, you start to hear your own assignment more clearly. God often hides your next instruction in his stillness. He stops speaking until you start listening differently. Silence forces you to tune your spirit to divine frequency. The same God who seems quiet begins to communicate through peace, through impressions, through divine alignment. You realize that he never stopped talking. He just changed the language. In the silence, God is also preparing others connected to your destiny. Sometimes he pauses your progress to mature the people who will walk with you. The silence may feel like stagnation, but it's actually synchronization. Heaven is setting divine appointments you don't yet know about. That's why you must stay still and trust the unseen orchestration of God's timing. When the silence lifts, you don't just receive answers, you receive authority. You come out carrying spiritual weight, discernment, and divine stability. You stop being moved by temporary noise because you've tasted eternal peace. The silence that once scared you now strengthens you. It becomes your secret place of power, where heaven and your heart meet in holy understanding. So when God is silent again, you'll smile instead of cry. You'll rest instead of panic, because you'll know he's moving in mystery, working in wisdom, and planning a manifestation greater than your imagination. His silence was never a rejection. It was an invitation into revelation. You'll realize that in God's kingdom, silence is not the end of a chapter. It's the prelude to glory. When God is silent, it is the final test before divine manifestation. The quietness that feels unbearable often comes just before breakthrough. Heaven always pauses before it pours. When everything in your life seems motionless, when the heavens seem sealed and prayers echo back unanswered, it's not abandonment, it's the tightening before release. God's silence is the sound of destiny being prepared behind the veil. Every divine silence precedes a divine sound, and every divine sound carries the fulfillment of promise. In that sacred stillness, God rewrites the coordinates of your destiny. He shifts people, seasons, and structures to align perfectly with his plan. You may think nothing is changing, but in the invisible, your name is being mentioned in rooms you've never entered. Your favor is being scheduled in calendars you don't know exist, and your victory is being scripted in realms beyond time. Silence is the prelude to surprise. God hides his movements so that no adversary can anticipate his next act. The silence of God is also the altar where maturity meets manifestation. It's where prayer transforms into power. When you've prayed every prayer and still see no change, heaven watches your posture. Will you still worship? Will you still believe? Those who continue in faith when heaven is quiet become vessels that carry unshakable authority. They no longer need proof because their spirit has already met God in the unseen. They have learned that silence is not distance, it is depth. When God finally breaks his silence, his words do not come softly. They come like thunder. They carry restoration for the years of waiting, healing for the pain of patience, and elevation for the humility learned in delay. He doesn't whisper a single answer. He multiplies blessings. He doesn't give you what you lost. He gives you what was promised with interest. The longer the silence, the greater the sound of manifestation. Heaven's delay is never empty. It's the building of a testimony that will shake generations. In the breaking of silence, the same God who seemed hidden becomes undeniable. Suddenly, the things that made no sense now fall perfectly into place. The prayers you cried in private begin to bear fruit in public. What once looked like confusion now reveals divine choreography. You realize the silence was a womb, and you were the seed. Every quiet moment birthed roots that now sustain the fruit of your destiny. Silence doesn't just prepare your blessing. It prepares you for the blessing. It shapes your character to carry glory without pride. It teaches you to remain grounded when favor arrives. Those who emerge from divine silence are not ordinary. They are transformed. Their voice carries heaven's weight. Their words carry prophetic fire, and their presence carries peace. The silence made them stable, unshakable, and fully surrendered. Every believer who walks through divine quietness graduates into divine authority. God can now trust you with his mysteries because you've proven faithful when there were no signs. You've shown heaven that your love is not conditional, that your faith is not transactional. Now, you don't just believe in God. You walk with him. You move from asking for answers to becoming one. You start to embody his message to others. That silence was never God's absence. It was his strategy. Then comes the shift. Heaven begins to speak again, but differently. No longer through words, but through results. The job opens, the healing manifests, the dream resurrects, the favor finds you. You begin to live in the manifestation of what silence prepared. You understand why he didn't rush, why he didn't explain, why he didn't move when you thought he should. His silence was the architecture of a glory that could not be built by human timing. And now you stand as living proof that God's silence is never in vain. The same lips that once cried, "Lord, are you there?" now declare, truly he was there all along. The same hands that once trembled in waiting are now lifted in victory. The silence gave birth to strength. The quietness built a crown. The season that felt empty has become the reason others believe again. You've become a testimony of how divine silence can produce everlasting glory. So the next time heaven grows quiet, do not despair. Remember this: silence is the sound of heaven working. When God is silent, he's securing your destiny, fortifying your faith, and preparing your victory. He is the God who speaks through stillness and answers through manifestation. Every pause in his voice is a prophecy in disguise. Every delay is a declaration that something greater is coming. Because when God finally speaks again, his silence will make sense. His quiet seasons will prove to be sacred. And every tear you shed in confusion will become a river of joy. The same silence that once broke you will now bless you. The quiet place will become your place of power. And you will know, beyond every shadow of doubt, that when heaven was silent, God was not gone. He was building your everlasting solution. When heaven finally breaks its silence, it does not whisper, it declares. It announces to every power that doubted you that the waiting was worth it. The very ground that once carried your tears becomes the stage for your triumph. Everything the silence refined in you, your patience, your obedience, your discernment, becomes the foundation for the destiny you are now stepping into. When God speaks again, it's not just to answer your prayer, but to reveal who you've become through the silence. In this divine unveiling, you discover that silence didn't just teach you to wait. It taught you to hear differently. You no longer listen for noise. You listen for peace. You no longer chase signs. You chase presence. The quietness has turned you into a sanctuary. You have become a vessel that carries the calm of heaven, even in the middle of storms. The silence of God has made you strong enough to stand when others fall, to believe when others doubt, and to praise, even when you don't yet see the promise. Every word God finally releases after silence carries multiplied weight. His yes after delay becomes unstoppable. His go after waiting opens doors that were once sealed by generations. You will realize that the silence was building your credibility in heaven. It made your prayers legal. It gave your voice authority. Now, when you decree a thing, It happens because silence baptized your words in divine trust. In this season of breaking silence, every buried dream starts to breathe again. The vision that looked dead begins to move. The passion that faded reignites. God begins to connect you with people who carry keys to doors you once thought were lost. What was hidden for years suddenly becomes visible, and every no you once received now makes sense. You see that the silence didn't stop your destiny. It positioned it. Then comes the overflow. The same God who seemed still now moves swiftly. Opportunities appear out of nowhere. Answers chase you down. Provision flows from unexpected places. Restoration comes with acceleration. Everything that was withheld returns in divine sequence, multiplied by the value of patience. Heaven begins to repay the years you endured in faith, and what once felt like silence becomes a symphony of victory. In that moment, you realize something profound. God never needed to explain himself to be faithful. His silence was not an oversight, it was orchestration. He was not ignoring your cries. He was preparing your crown. He was not denying your prayers. He was developing your purpose. Every second of silence was an act of mercy, ensuring that when he finally spoke, you would be mature enough to handle his glory. The silence of God has now become your weapon. You have learned that when he is quiet, it is not time to panic, but time to posture. You know that stillness means strategy, that quietness means construction. You've stopped doubting and started discerning. You've stopped fighting his silence and started flowing with it. Now, even in the quiet, you are confident that something powerful is being written about your life. And as you step into this new season, your story becomes a message to others who are still in their silent nights. You become the voice that says, "Don't give up. Heaven is not ignoring you. It's instructing you." You will tell them that every unanswered prayer has a purpose, that every tear is a seed, and that silence is the secret language of divine elevation. You will remind them that the darkest night always comes before the loudest dawn. So stand still, even when heaven seems still. Keep your heart pure, your worship steady, and your faith unshaken. The silence will break, the promise will speak, and when it does, the same world that thought you were forgotten will see you shining with divine evidence. Because what silence started, sound will finish. What stillness built, glory will reveal. And you will know that the God who was quiet was never absent. He was creating your everlasting solution. Stay protected, stay victorious. This is your everlasting solution.